Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. This is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers all things in what used to be known as the global war on terror, but we now call the Long War. We're back today for another update on Israel's war with Hamas, the expanding war. Of course, we're going to have Joe Truzman. He's back with us, my friend and colleague at FDD. He's a research analyst at FDD's Long War Journal, where he focuses primarily on Palestinian militant groups and Hezbollah. And then today, Behnam Ben Taleblu, also my friend and colleague, is a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. And so much more. Behnam is a wealth of knowledge on Iran, on the militant groups operating in the region, on weapons systems. Behnam, Joe, great to have you back on. Looking forward to today's discussion.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Hey, Bill.
Hey, Joe. The pleasure is ours, Behnam. We're going to start as we have been. Joe's going to give us just a brief update on where we are today, Monday, November 13th. Joe, where is the ground incursion into Gaza? Where does that stand? What type of progress has been made? What type of challenges have the IDF experienced? And then you could go beyond that and give us a quick update on the other fronts as well.
Yeah, I'll briefly mention just a few things. Yeah, so Israel continues to, with their ground operation, they have Gaza City encircled. Specifically, their main target, I think, is the Shifa Hospital, which has served as a command center for Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. So there's a lot of fighting in and around that area of that hospital. So it's going to be, I think that's going to be a goal for the Israelis to get in there and find out what can they find in there, right? Are there leaders, are there fighters still there? It's unclear, but that's one goal. But then there are other important fronts, just like you kind of mentioned. The Lebanon, for example, the fighting there is continued, and unfortunately, I see it getting worse over the last few days. There appears to be more cross-border attacks in the north than there is in the south, especially this morning and today. So that's concerning. And then, of course, we have the Shiite militias, or the Iran-backed militias in Syria and Iraq attacking American troops, American positions. And of course, there's always the Houthis in Yemen making claims of attacks against Israel, especially in southern Israel over the last few days. So there are a lot of active fronts. Also, and I can't forget to mention, is the West Bank. Now, the violence has continued there, of course, for the last 2.5 years, a huge uptick in violence. I don't see an explosion of a new active front there right now, but there's still violence going on there, but it's not anything more than what we saw pre-October 7th.
And Joe, really quickly, the IDF has established 2 humanitarian corridors, and they're doing, I guess you would call it a tactical pause for a couple hours a day to allow civilians, Palestinian civilians in the north, to move south to avoid the conflict zone there. Do you have an understanding of how many Palestinians are you taking advantage of this and moving south? And has Hamas been preventing them from leaving northern Gaza as they desire you basically use the civilians as human shields? Because, of course, when the body count runs up, it's really good for Hamas's propaganda.
Right. So it's difficult to say how many Palestinians. I don't have that data. I don't know. However, there are Palestinians taking advantage of it. All right. So for instance, earlier today, between 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock local time, the Israelis they established this this buffer zone, right, or this corridor, right? They call it, like you're saying, a tactical pause, and then it's just for specifically for Palestinians to move from north to south. and there's two reasons why the IDF is doing this. First and foremost, of course, they do distinguish between civilians and terrorists, right? So they want as many civilians out of the northern Gaza Strip because that's where they're operating. And then by doing this, it also helps them. It frees their hands, right, to attack Hamas, to attack the infrastructure of Palestinian terrorist organizations. So this is another very important reason why they're doing this. It benefits everyone. It benefits the Palestinian civilians, benefits the IDF, right? Of course, and Hamas doesn't like this. I mean, they use civilians as cover. They use civilian infrastructure to hide behind, right? So I'm not surprised, and there is evidence that Hamas is using human shields, and not only in this conflict, but in years past, right? So, again, but this is a very complicated situation, unfortunately. But at least we are seeing evidence that the IDF is doing their best in evacuating civilians from the north to the south, or facilitating that, rather.
The IDF is certainly in a lose-lose situation in its invasion with Gaza, at least when it comes to the press and the narrative, right? And it's just so difficult. And it's frustrating. We watch them make an effort to limit civilian casualties, and yet, it's just people forget what it is. It's a war. I go back to this, and I said this on BBC last night. The Israelis would not have invaded Gaza if it wasn't attacked and had 1,200 of its people killed and more than 260 hostages taken. Hamas could have, if it really cared about the civilians in Gaza, its leaders could surrender. It can conduct an unconditional surrender. Its fighters can surrender, and a new government, a new security situation could be established. That is certainly an option, but Hamas, they don't want that. And it's very, very clear that they are seeking to drive up the death toll among its own people because they just don't care about them. But we'll move on to the next issue. Since we spoke our last episode of Generation Jihad, there's been 2 U.S. airstrikes in Syria, one late last Thursday and another late yesterday. That would be Sunday the 12th. And 2 different sets of messages sent here. On Thursday, the U.S. repeated what it said on the first strike. So the first 2 times the U.S. targeted inside of Syria and eastern Syria, basically they hit weapons and munition storage depots. No civilian, or there was no casualties reported among either the IRGC or the militias, no civilian casualties as well. These appeared to be empty sites. And the first 2 times the U.S. military said, look, we're doing this reluctantly. They're doing it for deterrence reasons, and basically begged the Iranians and their militia proxies to not launch further strikes because we don't seek, quote, escalation. This time around, yesterday, the U.S. hit 2 facilities. One was a command and control center, which was also described as a safe house for the militias, and 6 to 7 militia fighters were reported killed. And then they also hit another weapons and munition storage depot, which apparently had some pretty big secondary explosions. And there was no talk of deterrence, no talk of de-escalation and whatnot. So I detected a little change of tone from the U.S. military. Maybe they're starting to realize that they're not. It's begging for deterrence, begging for de-escalation is actually seen as a sign of weakness in that part of the world, and not a sign of strength. So, Behnam, what are the implications here of these U.S. strikes? Do you think that the U.S. is doing enough to deter these Iran and its militias to end the attacks on the U.S. military bases? I've recorded at least 46 strikes. There may have been more. Or do you think they're still going to be emboldened? Are these strikes enough? Is launching strikes in Syria, which is basically a free fire zone where there's very few implications of launching attacks, is that going to get the message across, or does more need to be done?
Sadly, more needs to be done. This is an area where I think we've become an irritant to folks because we've said it so much. But the truth will set you free. in this instance, it is true that President Biden has used force more quantitatively than his predecessor, which had a very high bar for the threshold for the use of force, which was the loss of American life. So on the net, it is good that we are responding to things short of things that take life. So we are responding to drone attacks, successful or not. We're making interceptions. There's all of that. But geography matters. As you just mentioned, Syria is a free fire zone. There is no political cost to responding in Syria. So even these strikes that you string together, the three different U.S. military actions following the October 7 terror attacks by Hamas, that followed the wave of October 17 Shia militia rocket, drone, and mortar attacks on our positions in Iraq and our positions in Syria, all of that is necessary but not sufficient to even begin to change the equation. Now, I respect the changing kind of graduated escalation that the Defense Department seems to be going for. First going for facilities, then perhaps going for people, then changing the messaging on it. But I think the adversary understands that this is scalable, and therefore they will not, for lack of a better word, be quote unquote deterred. And I also think the language and the sophistication around the language of what it means to deter has actually been quite, with immense respect to people here, quite poor. Deterrence is not like turning on and off a light switch. We didn't get here by accident. We didn't get to the point where the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism has been able to train, arm, and equip different Iraqi and Syrian militias that operate on both sides of that border like it doesn't even exist, and fire in the dozens of times, anywhere from 40 to 50. There's some varying open source numbers on this in 3.5 weeks, and still only get 3 of these. And I would still, with respect to the last one, still say pinprick. And the reason I say that is because the nature of the first 2 strikes, plus what people saw on social media, which was the compound, or they heard on social media, I should say, which was the compounding explosions that followed the U.S. use of force in the most recent one, led people to believe, yes, this was a pretty significant weapon storage depot. So long as we continue to react to these strikes, we are going to fail to deter them. If the goal of some of these strikes is to handicap the regime, is to destroy some of the arsenals, well, these need to be happening independent of Iran-backed attacks on us, meaning regardless of their fire, we should be kinetically targeting their arsenals in Iraq and Syria, full stop. Second of all, we need to be responding against the point of origin, which, as you mentioned rightly, is Iraq. And we need to respond not just to the launch locations, but for places where it's fire and forget. We need to be able to hold those militias accountable. And as we've said on this show before, given that some of the Iraqi Shia militias have militias of their own and front groups of their own now, meaning the proxy has a proxy of itself, that tells you we need to play this Russian nesting dolls game, and we need to do it on steroids. And this impression of resolve that we give the American audience by responding in Syria and taking it from Iraq is unhelpful for the American audience to know what's going on, and it's unhelpful to change the local balance of power and the local equation. So we need more strikes. We need to be proactive, not reactive, and we need to actually make sure that they're in the right geography. And all of these 3 things together are necessary too, but they can still be drowned out by exogenous things like press releases that circumscribe what we're doing or limit what we're doing, or even fundamentally policy. The lack of an Iraq policy or still a permissive Iran policy can still drown out positive changes like those 3 things I mentioned that could be adopted with the aim of improving the stickiness of deterrence in this equation.
Yes, so much to digest there, and I'll just touch on, 1 or 2 parts, and I think you really hit on it. I can't remember where I said this, and I can't remember if I said it on Generation Jihad or elsewhere, but it seems to me that the messaging from the Pentagon, at least the first 2 times, was more directed at the U.S. public than it was directed at our enemies. And I find that rather worrying, because if it was directed at our enemies, it was not having the desired effect. And the second thing, look, for someone like me, and I get it, I'm a knuckle dragger, but I think actions speak louder than words here. I would say as little as possible, and you're right, you would need to launch strikes in meaningful places in Iraq, or dare I say, possibly in Iran, where this all originates. The only message I would be sending to the Iranians would be something like, do you like your oil production capacity or refinement capacity? Do you like that Navy that you have? Because you might not have them tomorrow if this continues. That would be the only message that I would be uttering. And of course, there would be international condemnation and talks of warmongering. But, the problem is, and a fundamental problem I think that exists in all of this is that some of those U.S. bases are very exposed. And in the other bases where there's more U.S. troops, they're largely dependent on the Iraqis, particularly in Syria. But in Iraq, we're dependent on the Iraqis, and we're worried about the Iraqis turning on us. I mean, anyone who saw those pictures of Secretary of State Blinken going into Iraq at night while wearing external body armor. I mean, if that isn't a message of weakness, of I don't trust you, my ally Iraq, I just watch the messaging coming out of state, coming out of the Department of Defense, and it's all wrong. The Iranians, we don't speak the same language as them, and we pay the price because of it.
Fundamentally, yes, it's a signaling problem. What we think is toughness is weakness, and vice versa. And the importance of the American domestic audience, which I'm not saying the American domestic audience should not be important. The U.S. taxpayer should be primus inter pares, but to have to craft your defense policy based on signaling back home that you're not starting a war, right, when you're really just trying to stop taking it 43-1 in terms of your response ratio, right? that seems to be a bit misguided. Iraq is one gigantic hangover. You know it. You lived it. All the LWJ fans know it. They lived it.
One gigantic.
One gigantic
that is
hangover.
Fantastic.
One gigantic hangover. You can't get DC to focus on this properly. But just on the basis, I will say this, and this is why I would endorse all of what you said, except yet the public messaging about striking in Iran. Ultimately, we know that's the eye of the octopus. Ultimately, we know that's where all these orders are coming on down from. I have no problem with using the military tool, but first I would like to perfect it outside of Iranian territory, because this is one social science experiment we have not ever run before in the 44-year history of the Islamic Republic, of inside Iran doing these things overtly and kinetically. And before we ramble on that hornet's nest, we need to understand that these guys respond to pressure with pressure of their own. Even they're responding to rocket attacks with rocket attacks of their own. So before we open up that hornet's nest, I'd like us to perfect this here. And my fear is we still fear what perfecting it looks like on the Iraq-Syria border. And I just want to add this one quote about the commander of the IRGC Aerospace Force. I think earlier this year in an interview, they do an interview every January after the missile barrage they fired at us in two positions in Iraq after the U.S. killing of Soleimani in January 2020. And in this interview, he was talking about U.S. bases in the region as being like lumps of meat under the teeth. And in particular, he's talking about Ain al-Assad and al-Harir and Tam. And while there may be more, CRAMs in some of these areas, in general, we cannot have an exposed posture. And I know you've said this a million times, Bill, so forgive me for the paraphrase, but option A, where we're all in, or option C, where we're all out, those are more sustainable options, because letting your troops get exposed to kind of persistent indirect fire and taking in dozens and dozens of traumatic brain injuries after traumatic brain injury and responding as offhandedly as we do is going to lead the regime not just to see these bases as meat under teeth, but trying to crunch on these bases as meat under teeth. So I think the way we're set up, if there are no changes to the force posture, there will be more, not less attacks, regardless of our response ratio in the short term.
Yeah, I concur. Joe, you have a lot of experience following these groups. Is what the U.S. is communicating, both via its public statements as well as its military response, is that viewed as strength or weakness in that part of the world?
Right. So I do have a follow-up question for Behnam, but I'll just say very quickly that, I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? That it's weakness. We can just see that. We see it already. These militias continue to attack, even right after the Americans, strike these warehouses right over command centers. So there's no deterrence right now. They don't see what the Americans are doing as anything that's going to scare them, right, to stop or deter them. And speaking of deterring, because we kind of talked about it earlier, this question for Behnam, or maybe even you, Bill, but I've been thinking about this for a while now, especially now, right after you kind of mentioned it, Behnam, the drone strike on Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and their entourage. Don't you think that was deterred the Qais al-Khazali type guys, the militias, the leaders? Don't you think that kind of put a scare into them to not to just, well, actually, yeah, to not only just cease, but at least temporarily cease attacks or operations against the Americans? Because it just seems to me that now they're not there's no scare. They're not scared, right? They're not deterred. And of course, I'm not trying to advocate for drone strikes against leaders of militias, but I'm just saying, I'm just thinking about what's happened in the past, right? And I think that really had a deterrent type effect on these groups back when it happened. I'm just curious what your thought is on all that, Behnam.
Partially, but this reminds me of the title of the Michael Hayden book, The Playing to the Edge, because even in that scenario, and I remember documenting this in a piece in 2020, I think, for LWJ about the rise in Iran-backed militia attacks, and we have a table. And unfortunately, this is not to discredit that attack, but it is to show what we are up against. January 2020 was one of the highest months ever for Iran-backed militia attacks, and that, on top of starting in May 2019, the Iranian desire to use the Iraqi proxies to fire at our positions in Iraq, compounded with the desire for quote unquote hard revenge after Soleimani, that led to some crazy peaks in violence by the Iran-backed militias in Iraq. So yes, it was a deterrent message, but it so spooked them that they felt that they have to respond. And this is not for us to say that if you don't respond, there will be strikes. If you do respond, there will be strikes. But it is to understand that they have an incentive for the strikes, sometimes to understand what that incentive is, and to be able to play the waiting game. To think that there would be one magic bullet, and I'm not saying you're saying that there would be one magic bullet, but to think that there would be one magic bullet and that these guys the networks would roll up overnight, I think the capabilities they have, the networks they have, are far from that today. So yes, I think it sent such a unique psychological message to the regime leadership. And it was unlike anything that the US had ever done in its history, perhaps with the exception of the tail end of the Iran-Iraq War, some of the things Bill was alluding to. But they assessed, and unfortunately rightly, that would be a flash in the pan. And they took the risk of significant escalation, both from them overtly with the ballistic missile barrages and them via indirect proxy via at least 10 or 12 different rocket attacks that month, making it one of the highest months ever in 2020 for violence against us in Iraq. They took the risk that it would not be sustained, that the political will that got us to the point of, okay, green light against Soleimani, could not be sustained after the use of force. The adversary understands the politics of our use of force too well now, such that in even the right conditions where it may happen, we're hoping for deterrence, yes or no. And I think they do see a story of change over time. And they have that longer runway, which will lead to the data, which will lead to someone like Jake Sullivan saying anytime there's a lull in the data, that their peace that they have bought peace, which is, again, fundamentally wrong. But it is a heck of a predicament. And I just wanted to paint it as like honestly and openly as possible, because I remember submitting that data to LWJ. That piece is there, tracking Iran-backed Shia militia attacks in Iraq. There's a huge table. And having folks understand that spike, but still understand the value of the Soleimani strike. We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time on these things.
And if I could add to that, I do concur, Behnam. That was the strike against Soleimani and Mohandas. It was a good start. But we didn't have the will to follow it through. You needed to take out Akram al-Kabi. You needed to take out Mustafa al-Shabani and, Qais Khazali. And, we go down the list of some of these key militia leaders who may as well be called IRGC operatives at this point. Certainly Abu Mohandas Mohandas certainly was an IRGC office. That's what his designation described him as. But we weren't willing to go down that road. Remember, after the strike that killed Soleimani, Iran launched, Behnam, you'll know the answer to this, a number of ballistic missiles against a U.S. base.
16.
How much was it?
16, reportedly. 16.
Yeah, against Ain al-Assad Air Base in Anbar province. And Trump, and I think over 20 Americans were wounded, like you mentioned before, as in a lot of these other attacks, concussions and traumatic brain injuries of U.S. troops. And Trump's response was, we're good. That's good. We did what we had to do. Now you stop. And then we saw that was the Iranian response. And of course, the Iranian response was the other militias conducted attack. We weren't willing to escalate, and not under the Trump administration, even as audacious as that attack against Soleimani and Mohandas was. He viewed it as a silver bullet, and the reality is you got to empty the arsenal, reload it, and come back again if you want to be serious. I also want to clarify too, when I'm talking about hitting targets inside of Iran, I'm going to be the last person here to advocate for opening. And after what I've witnessed of U.S. commitment in Iraq, and particularly in Afghanistan, how we abandoned an ally, the U.S. needs to think very, very carefully about how it wants to use force and what countries it wants to engage in military operations against. Because our problem is, and we talked it on the micro level here, right? The targeting of and killing of Mohandas and of Soleimani. Sure, that was great. I don't know if I ever mentioned this here on this program, but I call it McWar. What we want to pull through the drive-through, order our war, get out, chomp on it in the car, throw the wrapper out the window, drive home, and all happy and fun. And meanwhile, our enemies are going to the gourmet restaurant with a 7-course meal. They're in it for the long haul, and we want the fast food option for these wars. And that's no way to win them. Iran and the Taliban, all of our adversaries are committed to their cause, and they're in this for the long haul. And when we're not, they detect that. They view that's what they view as weakness, and they seize upon it.
Bill, you have to write that book, McWar.
Yeah, I use that with a couple of friends, and in the military, they love it. They just whenever I mention, but it's so. It's to me, I'm not self-aggrandizing my own whatever that is, analogy or whatever, but it fits, right? We operate on election cycles, and they operate on campaign cycles, but their campaign cycle is however long it takes. Iran's, some of these militias, as we discussed in the last program, right, were formed during the Iran-Iraq War. Hezbollah formed in 83, 84, whatever the date is. Iran-Iraq War was the 1990s. Then Bader's formed in that period. Many of the militias we're encountering in Iraq and Syria today were formed in 2003, right? They're playing a long game. We're not playing that game. So a single strike here, a single strike here, they're willing to weather those blows because they know that we aren't in it to win it. And that's all there is to it.
Right. I do want to just, speaking of Soleimani, I did want to ask another quick question, Behnam. Do you think, and of course, I'm sure many people have thought this, but when Soleimani was eliminated, do you think that weakened the IRGC? Just because, there's a lot, like, for the Iranian regime and its allies, Soleimani is a legend, of course. But in your eyes, do you see that the IRGC, the Quds Force, and the overall axis of resistance, when Soleimani was taken out, do you think that weakened them?
I think it significantly weakened them in the sense that it provided one of the first ever times they have experienced coordination problems due to the lack of personnel on their side. He was, you guys know better than I, you've been following and writing about this in LWJ. He was the connective tissue, not just professionally, but personally, with so many of these organs and organizations in Iraq and in Syria as well. And Bill just talked about that history. His personal biography participated in that history. You can't replace not just that kind of capability, but charisma, which on a battlefield can make all the difference, particularly for the hybrid warfare battlefields of half conventional, half asymmetric, half terror, half high tech, half low tech. I know that's a bunch of halves. My math is not that bad, but it's bad. He provided them a capability and an ease with which to effectuate a policy that it doesn't mean that they can no longer effectuate, but it simply means that the transaction cost for doing it has gone up. There was early reporting on this by AP about the nature of Ghani's visits to Baghdad in the 1.5 years after he had come in following 2020, and it looked like things were shaky then. There were some other folks in the region who, after the March, quote unquote, Saudi-Iranian peace deal, believed that some Iran-backed proxies in Iraq would be subject to principal agent problems, meaning the agents, the militias, would still want to fire on some of these targets and not listen to the quote unquote halt order of their patron. So I think in terms of logistics, in terms of connective tissue, in terms of ease of operations, he was irreplaceable. And you can never not prove a negative, meaning that there have been some think tankers who served in the Bush, Obama, and Trump White Houses, and they've come out. And I think one who served in the Bush administration, he said this publicly, but I won't share his name, but he did say this publicly, is that there was talk about going after Soleimani as early as 2007. So hypothetically, had that happened, the wars of the Middle East would have looked a lot different, and the casualty count of the U.S. and the coalition and Israel would have looked a lot different as well. So you can never prove a negative. But in this instance, if you just go back and you run this counterfactual, okay, the Middle East 2007 to present, and you imagine that without Soleimani, you could see a significant waning of the Iranian, kinetic capability against some of our forces there. But that doesn't mean that everything else they haven't put in place, like Bill was talking about. There's the personal and the professional. It doesn't mean that those other things that they haven't put in place don't work. The whole purpose of the axis of resistance is that these tentacles can move. The whole purpose of the proxy strategy is that it is the interest of the local actor married with the interest of the foreign patron. And in this case, the foreign patron provides the capability and the local actor has the intention, and you marry these two and you get this effective strategy. So this does provide caution for those who would think that all you need to do is cut off the head of the snake, or you got to go after this animal on both ends.
And someone who followed several targeted killing campaigns in Pakistan and Afghanistan against al-Qaeda's leadership, which we found out had to also expand to Yemen and Somalia and other places. The answer is yes and no. Yes, it was important to take out Soleimani. I completely agree with you, Behnam. He was more than just a tactician and an organizer. He became a myth into himself. I mean, I always go back to looking at those pictures from 2014 onward when the Shia militia commanders meeting with him.
And the Newsweek covers then.
Right. They were just, you could tell they desired to be in his presence. It was, to them, it was like meeting the rock star or meeting the Pope. Look, I can't prove this, but I've seen enough pictures of Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes that he dressed like Soleimani. He cut his hair like Soleimani. I'm convinced he dyed his beard to look like Soleimani's. I'm not kidding. There's pictures of this out there where I actually look at them and I have to do a double take. If I just looked at them real quickly, I would think I was looking at Soleimani and his security body double. So he was extremely important. But the problem is, I think his successor has done a pretty decent job. Would anyone disagree with me on that one?
I think he's got the resources,
Yeah.
He's got the resources. So where charisma lacks, where capability may take over.
Right.
And the fact that
exactly.
Iran can get $95 billion helps.
It does. And So sure, he may not, but you know what? Maybe his charisma develops over time. Maybe his organizational skills develop over time. But the reality is they built such an organization that it pretty much runs on its own. And all the IRGC needed was I'm guessing the Iranians aren't smart enough to not put all of their eggs in one basket. Sure, they recognize the importance of Soleimani. Look, Soleimani could go directly to Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and just get pretty much whatever he wants, right? I'm certain of that. Can his successor do that, or his successor's successor do that? Maybe not today, but maybe over time, given the achievements. The problem with targeted killing is if you're not willing to do it in a rapid enough fashion and get enough of the leadership that matters, that it's not going to work. In our drone campaign in Pakistan, particularly, and then also they're bleeding in Afghanistan, we killed a lot of them. I mean, we killed, but we didn't kill Zawahiri, and we didn't kill Osama bin Laden, not until 2011, right? But Al-Qaeda had a deep enough bench. We killed their number threes. We could call it your general manager. We killed their military commanders and whatnot. But we didn't kill. They had such enough of a deep enough bench. That's the State Department's term, not mine. That they were able to replace them, and they had these leaders had staffs, and these people were waging jihad. Many of them with resumes for decades, and who were important in their own right, and were waiting for the opportunity. And once we stopped that campaign, which pretty much around 2014, it started tapering off. Al-Qaeda was able to regenerate that leadership. Zawahiri took control from bin Laden. Sure, it had a setback in Iraq and Syria with the split between the al-Nusra Front and the Islamic State in Iraq. And sure, it led to the creation, but they're still there. And Afghanistan's under Taliban control now. And Mali and Somalia are looking pretty darn good for Al-Qaeda right now. And even though the Islamic State isn't competing, it is another jihadist force out there. Just going after leaders, killing one of them, it's good. It hurts in the short term. I am certain the RGC and Iran were scrambling because it wasn't like he retired. It wasn't like they planned for it, for him to go on that date. But they certainly at some point had to be prepared for him to be replaced. So I'll end my filibuster on targeted killing there. And
could I ask you guys a question on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Not to make the filibuster longer, but again, I haven't looked at this, but is there a way to compare and contrast whatever you may define as effectiveness of the targeted killing of the U.S. against AQ and again of Israel against Hamas? That would be an interesting study to run. How did they do it? Like, with what means? What was the goal? Was it to go after number one or the number three? Was it decapitate the snake or impede the flow of information and capability from the rank and file to the top? Was there a more effective strategy for how one does it than the other? I'm just thinking out loud here, but it's just, I don't know if you guys have looked at that, or if this is something that we borrow from or they borrow from in Israel. But
I could speak to the U.S. and then I'll let Joe comment on Hamas and other groups.
Yeah,
the U.S. believed that going after what they call the legacy leaders, it was of Al-Qaeda. And you'll still see, this is where President Biden stands up and says, look, there was only one Al-Qaeda leader in Afghanistan and we killed him. That was Zawahiri in 2021, right? Or actually it was 22. But that's just so it's a complete misunderstanding. You have to kill the leadership. You got to get those middle managers. Joe and I have talked about this a lot. They're really important because they're the ones who are going to replace, and they're also that connective tissue between the leadership and the fighters on the ground, right? So you're talking your battalion commanders, which is what they would call them, or the heads of the Shura members, the heads of the military, the heads of the communications. How can you detect this? That there's been, obviously drop in attacks would be one way but who knows? That may or may not be true. Seeing degradation of propaganda and communications within the group, inability to appoint new leaders. Those are all metrics that you can use. Defections from the groups, right? Joining other groups, things like that will tell you. Now, as far as what is Israel's view on that, like I'm gonna defer to Joe on that and just say that, I think that they would have to have a similar strategy of going after not just the top guys, and they're important, don't get me wrong, but like, the IRGC was always more than just Qasem Soleimani, right? There's, I've looked at the designations. There's guys whose names are not household names or not even known within the whatever community we are, right? The terrorism, wherever you put Iran into that block, right? And I've looked at these designations and said, you know what, that guy looks pretty damn important. Here's the guy who was coordinating Iran's support for the Taliban and Al Qaeda. Oh, and by the way, he's now their new, he's now the head of Quds Force, right? I looked at him a decade ago and saying, this guy's interesting, right? This is an interesting job this guy has. So if you're not going after those guys while you're going after Qasem Soleimani, you're just kind of kicking the can down the road, right? You're chipping away at the problem. And organizations like the IRGC or Al Qaeda or Hamas or Hezbollah, they can weather losses as long as they're, as long as they're not critical. And as important as, and again, as Soleimani was to the IRGC, to Quds Force, it wasn't founded by him, and it wasn't going to die with him. That's now, Joe. That's your opportunity to talk about Israel.
Yeah. I was going to say, yeah, you're right. I agree with what you're saying. As far as Hamas is concerned, I think the Israelis learned that targeted killing can be effective, but it's not always effective, right? So, like in the early 2000s or throughout 2000s, the Israelis, they hammered Hamas, they hammered their leadership, and they took out Yassin, for example, and then Jabari, and then so on and so forth. These Hamas leaders, but then they were just being replaced, right? So, and now today we have Yahya Sinwar, who's probably the most powerful, at least the top two, maybe three leaders of Hamas ever, right? So, but he's still around. So, but then the Israelis have also taken out, guys underneath. Engineers, for example, engineers that work on rockets, that work on drones. That's important. Commanders, of so-called elite units, the Nukhba units that Hamas has. So those are important targets as well. But also sometimes things can backfire. When the Israelis took out Abbas al-Musawi, this former Secretary General of Hezbollah, look who replaced him, Hassan Nasrallah. So it's so it doesn't always work out. Just taking out a leader. So I think that's important to note. I think the Israelis have learned that, and that's why you don't see it nearly as much. I mean, obviously, in a time of war with the Israelis, in regards to Israelis, yeah, they do take out guys, but generally during like general times, like when there's not an active conflict, you don't see the Israelis taking out leaders of like Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, because I think they've learned from past strikes. There are some occasions we've seen it in, I think it was 2019. There was a Islamic Jihad commander. It was either 2019, where he kept firing rockets, all right, at Israel. So Israel took him out. But those are just happens. It doesn't happen much. So anyways, I think the Israelis have learned about targeted strikes, that they're not always effective. I think that's the biggest point I want to make here.
Yeah, and this is Israel's opportunity to dismantle Hamas, because they're going to be in there, but they're going to be cautioned. They need to take out the top leadership outside of Gaza as well, and that if that's all done as a holistic effort, they can have success against Hamas, because right now they're taking out, as you noted, battalion commanders, engineers, bomb makers, the clerks, the financial guys who are there. Look, Hamas is right. Should they go after the members of the propaganda people from the health ministries and things like that? These are the people that make Hamas run, and this is Israel's opportunity to go after them. They're not going to get a second chance. So if they don't do it now, It's just Hamas is going to perpetuate, right? When you're taking out fighters, when you're taking out low-level commanders, when you're taking out mid-level commanders, when you're taking out key leaders all at the same time, at some point that stresses out the group.
Yeah, it's if Israel says the goal is to dismantle Hamas in Gaza, I just can't imagine them not going after the leadership or the Hamas's leadership staying in place, right? If with a so-called dismantled Hamas, it doesn't work like that. Just like you're saying, then there's Hamas leadership abroad in Qatar and Turkey, especially those areas. So this is definitely going to be a long campaign, I would say, if Israel is going to stick with it and destroy Hamas or dismantle Hamas.
All right, let's we I think we beat that horse to death. Let's move on. There's been a string of Houthi attacks against Houthis, otherwise known as Ansar Allah. It is not an Iranian proxy. I describe it as an Iranian ally, or they've been co-opted by Iran. The Houthis weren't created by Iran, but they share an ideology, and the Iranians have basically taken them under their wing and supported them. So in one of these, they've used drones, they've used cruise missiles, and I believe the previous attack, not the last one, they used ballistic missiles as well. Behnam, you know quite a bit about this, the use of ballistic missiles. What does this mean? Talk a little bit about the Houthis' capabilities and Israel's abilities to counter them.
Sure, this is dangerous because, in essence, we have the Houthis, which are I'll frame it this way, part of this constellation of proxies that the regime has either created in places like Iraq or Lebanon, or in places like Gaza with Hamas and Houthis in Yemen. They've co-opted a cause and brought them under their wing through sustained political and material support. And that material support has really come since the war in Yemen, since the Houthis took over Sana'a, the capital, in 2014, in the form of long-range strike technology, drones, missiles, precision strike technology, precision-guided munitions, and ballistic missiles. And to date, the Houthis are the only partner or proxy of Iran with medium-range nuclear-capable ballistic missiles. And I'll get into this in a second, because the strikes that we saw on Riyadh, even towards Mecca, strikes towards Yanbu in 2017, 2018, were short-range ballistic missiles. And I'm using the military terminology here, which is for under 1,000 kilometers, over 300, under 1,000. And those were things I had the pleasure of going to the Joint Base Anacostia Bowling exhibit in 2018-19. And you get to stand next to one of these things. It's a modified Scud. It's finless. It's quite big and still short range. The Houthis have medium range ballistic missiles, and for the first time ever, they fired one in August 2019 towards Dammam in the eastern province, Saudi Arabia. It flew, I think, between 1,200 and 1,400 kilometers, depending on the point of firing. And then they called that the Burkan 3. And then they renamed it the Zulfiqar, and that was pulled away. It wasn't used again. Then in overland attacks in February 2022, they fired it at U.S. positions, even bases, even an airport at the UAE. Fortunately, those were intercepted. I think it was the first field use of THAAD that intercepted this ballistic missile. And they fired it in a kind of combined arms operation with land attack cruise missiles, some of which the Houthis have had since 2017, as well as with drones. And you've seen Houthi drone power grow consistently alongside missile, cruise, and ballistic power. But then in 2023, September, 1 month before the terror attack against Israel, every September, the Houthis put on a big military parade about the anniversary of their conquest and the start of the military operations. And every September, they roll out on a bunch of trucks all of their military capabilities and what is new. And in 2022, they showed a lot of shorter range precision strike stuff, things that Iran also hadn't given to other proxies yet. But this year in September, I believe they showcased a missile they called the Tufan, which is a medium-range nuclear-capable liquid propellant ballistic missile It's basically a repainted Badr ballistic missile, which is one of Iran's 2,000 kilometer flying ballistic missiles. This one, we believe, can go 1,800 to 2,000 kilometers. It has the same kind of baby bottle triconic warhead, same fin structure, same kind of yellow liquid propellant plume after the launch. And in essence, this is what we believe was fired at Israel towards Eilat, we believe. This, I also believe, was used in the first operation where I believe the U.S., using those Aegis ballistic missile destroyers, fired an SM-2 against that munition. But they're also employing this combined arms approach. And in 2017, the first time ever, LWJ documented that the Houthis had an intent to intervene in a war between Israel and the Palestinians, or Israel and Hezbollah. It was brushed off. 2019, Houthi officials again re-upped this threat. It was brushed off. If you remember, either in 2019 or 2020, even Bibi's plane, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plane, had to take an alternate route, I think, to go to the UAE or to go to another Arab country in the Persian Gulf because of the potential for Houthi missile trajectory over the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And now they're making good on this threat. They're not going to expend the firepower, in my view, at the rate that we're seeing the firepower be expended by the proxies in Iraq and Syria. But this is an entirely new equation. It is more proof of this ring of fire theory that you've heard people talk about, where the Iranians are not just having proxies, but proxies with long-range strike capabilities all around Israel. And it's another complicating factor designed to slow the war effort, designed to erode public morale for the war effort by the Israelis in Gaza against Hamas. And again, military tools towards a political aim. The Houthis are not trying to score battlefield victory against the IDF. They are trying to hinder the fighting spirit behind them, to create the terror with the potential for casualties in a casualty-averse society, and then say that this could be multiplied by 10 if the conflict continues. So you've seen the Houthis not just fire these things against the Saudis first, then the Emiratis, now the Israelis. They also recently shot a U.S. drone out of the sky about a week ago. And so they're also now adapting this Shia militia playbook, which is to say that they are firing on U.S. assets in the hopes of also having the U.S. come in to constrain Israel. So Iran is bringing different elements of its axis of resistance online using whatever long-range strike capabilities they have. Again, noting that the Houthis have by far and away the most advanced one, despite this kind of distance between them, between patron and proxy. And I think this is, again, a telltale sign of the future. There will be more, not less, long-range strike technologies in the hands of proxies and non-state actors. There will be more indirect fire and multi-directional fire in future Middle Eastern wars. And ballistic and aerial defense is going to have to play an even greater role in the force protection of any army operating in any theater in the Middle East, as Iran is set to continue to be using these assets. So again, this is all stuff that is scaling up in real time, and we're kind of in the hypothesis phase of it right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. They're forcing the Israelis to, obviously, they're going to have to, not that the Israelis wouldn't have resources deployed, but they have to redouble their efforts, right, to prevent attacks coming from this area. I think it also adds another complication regionally. The Saudis. I mean, if the Saudis are intercepting missiles fired by the Houthis, it can be perceived as the Saudis are protecting the Israelis. Now, look, they're the Saudis and a missile's heading your way from Yemen. Well, you've been under attack before. You're going to want to intercept those things. How do you know it's slated to land in Israel and it's not slated to go somewhere else before it reaches its destination? So I think it also puts an element of political pressure on the Saudis, and that certainly feeds into weakening the Saudis in the Arab world and strengthening the Iranians. Let's take a look now at the what's happening in northern Israel and in southern Lebanon. The Hezbollah clearly has been stepping up its attacks over the I think since we last spoke. Joe, would you agree with that? Tell us what's happening.
Yeah. There. So there have been more attacks, especially today. Cross-border attacks, right? And more than I think there have been in Gaza and southern Israel. So which is interesting. It's just a trend, a concerning trend, a developing trend I'm noticing. Something else that was really interesting, it kind of goes back to what Behnam was talking about earlier, sort of, but last week, forgive me, I don't know if I can't remember if it was Thursday or Friday, a drone exploded or hit near a school in southern Israel in Eilat. And at first I thought it was from the Houthis, but appears, and the IDF said that it was a drone that came from, I think, from Syria. It wasn't
Syria,
from
yeah, they said it was Syria.
yeah, exactly. Forgive me, there's just so much going on, trying to remember everything. And then the day after, right, there was an attack in Syria, and then all of a sudden we hear that Hezbollah lost seven members of its seven of its members, and Nasrallah
In Syria, yeah.
in Syria. Yes, I'm sorry. So this basically what's happening here is that even though things are happening in Lebanon, right, and southern Lebanon, northern Israel, between these two actors, between Israel and Hezbollah, there's still other things happening in other countries, right? Between the two groups, between the two actors. So, and then last week there was a report about Hezbollah attempting an attack in Brazil against either, I think it was a Jewish target. It wasn't super specific, but so anyway, the point being is that just because these two actors are most of the action is happening between in Lebanon, southern Lebanon, and northern Israel. It's leaking out, right? It's happening in other areas, in Syria and now in Brazil. So it's all very interesting, I think, but of course it's very dangerous. And this is not even a full-blown war, right? A full-blown conflict between the two. So I think that's another reason why people are very concerned about things just an all-out war between Israel and Hezbollah.
Yeah, and Behnam, like this is the axis of resistance strategy of Iran, right? You got attacks coming from Yemen, you got attacks coming from Syria, you got attacks coming from Lebanon, you got Shia militias in Iraq and Syria starting to bear down on the U.S. Would you agree that this is what it looks like, and it's really hasn't been dialed up, right?
No, this is the potential for them to scale it up, and we've seen despite tons of the cross-border stuff, Hezbollah still very gradually scale it up, because again, when you talk about this axis of resistance, despite the Houthis having some of these more advanced capabilities, and despite there being proxies older than Hezbollah, such as Badr in Iraq, the Hezbollah remains the crown jewel. In some ways, with the IRGC Quds force and with or without Soleimani, it's the connective tissue between the Houthis, between most of the Arab proxies and the IRGC Quds force. And has also posed thus far the most successful conventional deterrent against Israel, against any kind of overt kinetic attack by the IDF or IAF on Iran's nuclear facilities. So it makes most sense that out of all the Iran-backed proxies in the region, Hezbollah is taking the page from Khamenei when you saw in the Nasrallah speech recently, where he also supported the October 7 attacks, but then also tried to distance himself from it to buy space to avoid that kind of kinetic response. But also they are subject to the same pressures. And it's not, again, just like the language, like deterrence has been poor in DC, the language about having Hezbollah, quote unquote, enter the fray, I have to say with respect, has also been a little bit poor. It's not that drone attacks and anti-tank weapons don't matter, but it's also not that Hezbollah isn't scaling up, like with the drone attack that Joe just mentioned, or with the greater quantity of fire on the northern border. The fact that this isn't yet a third Lebanon war, but the fact that the IDF spokesperson does have to come out and say the things that he's been saying, especially things that we heard this Sunday, and the fact that you have had major populations try to move from the north, all while the most heavy parts of the Hezbollah arsenal, the Fateh 110s, the Zelzal 2 rockets, and the converted Zelzal 2s have not been 100% brought online yet. And it is this closer range, shorter range stuff that they can even fire kind of parallel versus on a lofter trajectory for range. This is all proof that they're saving Hezbollah. The greater the Hezbollah involvement, the more keen the greater the Hezbollah involvement, the more a sense of worry you could see by Iran. The lesser the Hezbollah involvement, the more content with bringing on different elements of this proxy network online. They're not going to sit on the sidelines and watch Hamas get destroyed, but I think also they have an incentive to try to conserve their firepower. And so compared to the other militias, you've seen the scale up been slower, but that doesn't mean, as Joe just mentioned, that the scale up has not been any less lethal. And understanding this fine line between Hezbollah's involvement really will give you knowledge about the catch-22 that Iran is in. Because the more of these proxies you bring online, the greater the potential for each of these proxies to face their own Vietnam if Israel or America does decide to respond to A, the point of origin, or B, to help change that deterrence equation in a place outside of Gaza.
Yeah, it's I think that's right. I mean, the way you explain that, Behnam, right? Like all these militias, they're chipping in, but they're not fully committing their forces. Whether they do at some point, that's everyone's fear here, right? Because that certainly will spark a wider regional war. I have no doubt of that. But like right now, they're just doing enough to keep Israel guessing, keep everyone guessing here. Last quick topic we'll talk about here. Hamas. They certainly have a sophisticated and integrated anti-tank force. I've seen more than enough videos of Israeli armor and Israeli armored bulldozers and tanks and armored vehicles being hit by Hamas anti-tank rocket teams. Behnam, give us a little sense of how Hamas is using the tactics of its anti-tank forces to slow down the Israeli advance in Gaza, and what does the IDF have to, or do we think that they're having everything thrown at them now, or do we think this is going to look even worse if and when the IDF has to go into southern Gaza?
I don't believe this is everything, but I do have concerns. And I don't believe this is everything, and I do have concerns there could be a heck of a lot more. You know, Hamas has tons of anti-tank weapons, North Korean copies, Russian ones, Soviet ones, Iranian ones. And unlike some of the shorter range rocket stuff, where I think for well under 100 kilometers, these are things that are now kind of foreign inspired but locally produced. Much of the anti-tank weapons, I believe, were still via smuggled routes or could assume to be more largely based on foreign sources than domestic production. You see, quote unquote, domestic production lines that Hamas touts for some of these RPGs, but they really seem to be more like paint shops or assembly shops than actual raw material production. So I think this is where they still have a bit of foreign dependency. And in a sense, they get to pick up the tactics of these foreign fighters. You know, the way the Russians provided anti-tank weapons to guerrillas around the world in the past, as well as the way, you know, Iran has been helping them train in this way. Most worrisome, in the 2021 war and the May war, you saw anti-tank teams showcase their effectiveness against Israeli civilians as well as against Israeli soldiers. And what I mean by teams is, let me just draw a parallel. You know, when we talk about ammunition, if you want to say like it's effective or it's capable, you know, you talk about lethality, but you can talk about precision. The precision is for the munition. The accuracy is for the person deploying the munition. And in this sense, the anti-tank teams becoming more capable. When we talk about that, it's not just that the systems they have are getting more advanced, because really it's been, you know, 4 or 5 different systems that they have, and that's kind of been it. It's the capability to employ these. As Israeli armor improves, they know to fire, you know, in consecutive rounds against the similar position on the side of the tank. There are things you see in Hamas training videos about how to spring up on APCs, about you know, having multiple people assist the person firing with targeting for those side parts of those Israeli tanks and APCs. So, in general, my fear is the more short-term success the Israelis have, given the stockpile of anti-tank weapons, but given the challenges of operating in kind of rubble and urban combat. And again, Bill and you and LWJ and folks have been talking about how this happened for the US and Iraq in spades in the 2000s. My fear is, you know, the short-term success may be offset or mitigated or even impeded by medium-term issues with, you may clear an area, but how do you hold on to an area? And I think anti-tank weapons and the capability of these kind of sneak attack anti-tank teams coming in through tunnels and kind of fire and forget and running away and dispersing will create problems. And you see it in the very, very short term. It hasn't been, the end all be all, but I could see this as a problem also scaling up as Israel moves further south, and it becomes about, clearing and holding territory.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, one of the things here that's very concerning is something the U.S. hasn't had to deal with in Iraq or Afghanistan is that network of tunnels. It's a force multiplier for anti-tank teams, for IED teams, things, sniper teams, the ability to move in that manner. That's where it's really critical for Israel. It doesn't have to just hold the ground. It has to hold below the ground. Well, Behnam, Joe, thank you very much for joining us. Excellent conversation. Fascinating. I'm sure we could go on, but I think we've hit an hour right about now, and it's been a great conversation. Let's get you back on soon, Behnam.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure, both of you, to share this virtual mic and just keep an eye on what's going on in the region, because everyone is following the LWJ reporting and podcast analysis of the facts coming out. So thank you guys for what you do.
Thank you, Behnam. Thanks, Joe. And thanks, everyone, for joining us for today's episode of Generation Jihad. A reminder, you could find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review, preferably a positive one, but only if we earned it. Thanks again. We'll see you all again soon.